September 22, 1985. Five men walked into the Plaza Hotel in New York City. What happened in that room over the next few hours would destroy the world's fastest-growing economy, trigger a financial crisis that would last 40 years, and reshape the entire global economic order. The Japanese called it the beginning of their lost decades. Economists call it one of the most consequential policy decisions in modern history. But here's what nobody talks about: it might have been the most successful economic warfare operation ever executed. Disguised as international cooperation, the meeting itself was shrouded in secrecy. Preparatory sessions had been held throughout the summer of 1985 in locations across the globe: Tokyo, Paris, Hawaii, London. The media knew something was brewing, but the exact agenda remained classified until the very last moment, when the announcement came. Financial markets around the world held their breath. The finance ministers and central bank governors of the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, the five most powerful economies on Earth, had reached an agreement. They called it a cooperative effort to promote global economic stability. History would remember it very differently. By 1985, Japan was unstoppable. The island nation that had been reduced to rubble just 40 years earlier was now the world's largest creditor, the biggest exporter of cars and electronics, and home to the most valuable companies on Earth. Japanese workers were outproducing Americans. Japanese manufacturers were outcompeting American factories. Japanese banks were buying up American real estate and corporations. The Nikkei stock index was soaring. Tokyo real estate was the most expensive on the planet. Economists weren't asking if Japan would become the world's largest economy. They were asking when. Some predicted it would happen by the year 2000. Japan was on track to become number one, and America was terrified. To understand just how dramatic Japan's rise was, you have to go back to the 1950s and 60s. This was a country that had been devastated by war, its cities reduced to ash, its industrial capacity shattered. Yet within a single generation, Japan had achieved what historians call an economic miracle. The transformation was staggering. Japanese companies weren't just competing, they were dominating. Toyota and Honda were crushing Detroit. Sony and Panasonic were redefining consumer electronics. Japanese semiconductors were powering the computer revolution. The phrase "made in Japan," once a punchline suggesting cheap, inferior goods, had become a mark of quality and innovation. The numbers tell the story. Between 1980 and 1985, Japan's trade surplus with the United States exploded from $13 billion to over $33 billion. Japanese cars flooded American roads. Japanese semiconductors dominated global markets. American companies like Caterpillar and IBM were getting crushed. The mighty American manufacturing sector, the engine that had won World War II and built the post-war prosperity, was dying. And the weapon killing it wasn't military, it wasn't political, it was the exchange rate. But these numbers only scratch the surface of what was really happening. In the American Midwest, the industrial heartland that had powered America's rise to superpower status, factories were closing at an alarming rate. Steel mills that had operated for generations were going bankrupt. Auto plants were laying off thousands of workers. In cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, unemployment was reaching crisis levels. Entire communities built around manufacturing were collapsing. The social fabric was tearing apart. Workers who had spent their entire careers in these industries, who had expected to pass these jobs down to their children, were suddenly obsolete. The anger in these communities was palpable, and it was directed at one target: Japan. American workers watched as Japanese companies, with their seemingly unstoppable efficiency, took market share in industry after industry. They watched as their factories closed while Japanese factories expanded. They watched as their standard of living declined while Japan's rose. This wasn't just an economic issue anymore. It was becoming a national crisis, and politicians knew they had to respond. Here's where it gets interesting. The Japanese yen was dramatically undervalued against the dollar. This meant Japanese exports were artificially cheap while American goods were artificially expensive. Japanese manufacturers could sell their products in America at prices American companies simply couldn't match. It wasn't that Japanese companies were necessarily more efficient, though many were. It was that the currency imbalance gave them an advantage that made competition nearly impossible. American factory workers were losing their jobs by the thousands. Entire industrial towns were collapsing, and Congress was furious. The currency dynamics were complex, but the effect was simple. The strong dollar was pricing American manufacturers out of global markets. Between 1980 and 1985, the dollar had appreciated by nearly 46% against major currencies. This appreciation was driven by Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker's tight monetary policy, designed to crush inflation that had ravaged the American economy in the 1970s. Volcker's medicine worked. Inflation came down, but the side effect was a dollar so strong that American exports became uncompetitive while imports flooded in. For Japanese manufacturers, it was a perfect storm of opportunity. By early 1985, the situation had reached a breaking point. American lawmakers were drafting protectionist legislation that would have slapped massive tariffs on Japanese goods and potentially started a full-scale trade war. The Reagan administration faced an impossible choice: let Congress destroy the global trading system with protectionism, or find another way to level the playing field. They chose the second option, but the solution they crafted wouldn't level the playing field. It would tilt it so dramatically in America's favor that Japan would never recover. The atmosphere in Washington was toxic. This wasn't just policy debate, it was raw political anger. Republican congressmen staged a public spectacle in which they took sledgehammers to a Toshiba radio and the Capitol lawn, smashing it to pieces while cameras rolled. The symbolism was clear and deliberately inflammatory. Japan wasn't just an economic competitor anymore. In the minds of many Americans, Japan had become the enemy, an unfair player gaming the system, stealing American jobs and prosperity. Trade protectionism had bipartisan support in Congress, with Democrats and Republicans competing to see who could be tougher on Japan. Before we dive into what happened at that meeting, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next video, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global audience come together to understand these crucial financial stories. Now, let's talk about the meeting that changed everything. The Plaza Accord, as it came to be known, was sold to the world as a cooperative agreement. 5 nations, the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, coming together to address currency imbalances and promote global economic stability. The official story was simple. The dollar was too strong, and coordinated intervention in currency markets would help correct this imbalance by 10 to 12%. Everyone would benefit from more balanced trade. It was presented as economic multilateralism at its finest. The media praised it as a triumph of international cooperation. Financial analysts called it enlightened policymaking. The Plaza Accord was hailed as proof that the major economies could work together to solve global problems. But look closer at what actually happened in that room. The Americans had been planning this for months. Secret meetings between Treasury officials and their Japanese counterparts throughout the summer of 1985 had laid the groundwork. Japan's finance minister, Noboru Takeshita, walked into the Plaza Hotel knowing exactly what America wanted: a massive appreciation of the yen. And here's the crucial detail that history often glosses over. Takeshita agreed to accept yen appreciation all the way to 200 yen per dollar, a move that would make Japanese exports significantly more expensive. Why would Japan agree to something that would devastate its export-driven economy? Because the alternative was worse. The pressure on Japan had been building for months, not just from the United States but from European nations as well. The French government, in particular, had been pushing for currency intervention, seeing the strong dollar as destabilizing to global trade. But the real power in the room was American, and American officials had made their position crystal clear in those preparatory meetings. Treasury Secretary James Baker and his team had laid out the stakes in unmistakable terms. Cooperate on currency adjustment. or face the full wrath of the American political system. The Americans had made it clear either Japan accepts currency revaluation, or Congress would pass legislation that would effectively ban Japanese goods from American markets. Section 301 trade actions were already being prepared against Japanese semiconductor manufacturers. The Semiconductor Industry Association had filed petitions with the U.S. Trade Representative, claiming unfair competition. Dumping investigations were underway. The legal and political machinery was already in motion to shut Japanese products out of American markets. The political atmosphere in Washington was toxic. American congressmen were literally smashing Japanese electronics with sledgehammers on the Capitol lawn. Japan was being given a choice between a bullet and poison. They chose the poison, thinking they could manage it. They were catastrophically wrong. But there's another layer to this that reveals just how cornered Japan felt. Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone had made a strategic calculation that went beyond simple economics. He believed that if Japan didn't cooperate on currency adjustment, the resulting trade war would permanently damage the U.S.-Japan alliance, which was the cornerstone of Japanese security policy. Japan had no military power to speak of, relying entirely on American protection against potential threats from the Soviet Union and an increasingly powerful China. Nakasone believed that maintaining good relations with America was worth almost any economic cost. He was betting that Japan could absorb a currency adjustment and emerge stronger by pivoting toward domestic consumption. That bet would prove to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in economic history. What happened next was supposed to be a controlled correction. The Plaza Accord called for a 10 to 12% depreciation of the dollar against other major currencies. That would have been manageable. That would have helped American exports while still allowing Japan to compete. But that's not what happened. The yen was at 240 to the dollar before the Plaza meeting. Within days, it hit 216. By the end of 1985, it approached 200, but the appreciation didn't stop there. It kept going and going. By 1988, the yen had appreciated to around 127 per dollar. Japanese exporters were earning nearly half as many yen for every dollar of exports. The currency adjustment had gone from a 10% correction to an almost 100% revaluation in just 3 years. The speed and magnitude of the yen's appreciation shocked everyone, including the American officials who had engineered the Plaza Accord. Currency markets, once they start moving in one direction, tend to overshoot as traders and investors pile on. Speculators saw the yen appreciating and bet on further appreciation, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Japanese companies trying to hedge their currency exposure only amplified the move. Within months, what was supposed to be a measured adjustment had turned into a currency avalanche. Japanese officials pleaded with their American counterparts to slow down the appreciation, but the market had taken on a life of its own. Think about what this meant for a Japanese manufacturer. Imagine you're running a factory in Tokyo making electronics for the American market. On September 21, 1985, you sell a television in America for $100 and receive 24,000 yen. By 1988, that same television still sells for $100 in America, but now you only receive 12,000 yen. Your revenue in yen terms has been cut in half, but your costs in Japan, your workers' salaries, your factory rent, your raw materials are all still priced in yen. Your profit margin hasn't just shrunk, it's been obliterated. This wasn't just a theoretical problem. Real companies with real workers faced real consequences. Toyota and Honda, which had built their global empires on efficient manufacturing and competitive pricing, suddenly found their business models upended. They could raise prices in dollars, but that would make them less competitive against American and European rivals. They could absorb the loss in profit margins, but that was unsustainable. Or they could move production overseas, which is exactly what many companies started doing. Japanese manufacturers began building factories in America and Southeast Asia, exporting not just products but entire industries and the jobs that came with them. The export sector, which had been the engine of Japan's miracle growth, went into a tailspin. Companies that had thrived for decades found themselves suddenly uncompetitive. Small and medium-sized manufacturers, the backbone of Japan's industrial base, were hit especially hard, and like large corporations with diverse revenue streams and overseas operations. These smaller companies depended entirely on exports. Many went bankrupt. The survivors barely held on, hoping the yen would reverse course. It didn't. The Japanese government knew they had to do something. They couldn't just watch their export economy collapse. So they did what seemed logical at the time. They slashed interest rates to stimulate domestic demand and offset the impact of yen appreciation. The Bank of Japan cut rates from 5% to 2.5% between 1986 and 1987. They kept rates low, flooding the economy with cheap money. The idea was to shift Japan from an export-led economy to a domestic consumption-led economy, stimulate internal demand, boost domestic investment, build infrastructure, develop the service sector. It was sound economic theory. In practice, it created the largest asset bubble in modern history. The government also launched massive stimulus packages, spending on infrastructure projects across the country. Roads, bridges, tunnels, and public facilities sprouted up everywhere, many in places that didn't particularly need them. The government was essentially paying companies and workers to build things whether or not those things made economic sense, just to keep money flowing through the economy. This approach worked. In the short term, unemployment stayed low, and GDP growth remained positive, but it was creating deeper problems that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Here's what happens when you combine ultra-low interest rates with an economy that just lost its primary growth engine. People start looking for places to park their money. And in Japan in the late 1980s, there were two main options: stocks and real estate. With interest rates so low, borrowing money became incredibly cheap. Japanese banks, facing reduced demand for business loans from export manufacturers, started aggressively lending for real estate and stock market speculation. The money supply exploded, and asset prices went absolutely insane. The transformation of Japan during these bubble years was surreal, like watching a nation collectively lose touch with reality. In the financial districts of Tokyo, young stockbrokers were making fortunes overnight. Office workers who had never invested before were quitting their jobs to day trade stocks. Stories circulated of ordinary salarymen who had turned modest savings into millions through lucky investments in property or equities. The wealth felt real because asset prices kept rising, validating every inflated purchase with even more inflated valuations. Tokyo real estate became the most expensive in human history. At the peak of the bubble, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California combined. Let that sink in for a moment. A single plot of land in central Tokyo, regardless of how historically significant, was being valued higher than the entire state of California, its cities, its farmland, its commercial properties, everything. It was madness, but nobody wanted to acknowledge it because everyone was getting rich, at least on paper. Japanese companies were buying trophy properties in America: Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course, Columbia Pictures. These purchases weren't driven by sound business logic. They were driven by a combination of pride, hubris, and the need to deploy massive amounts of capital that was burning holes in corporate balance sheets. When Mitsubishi Estate bought a controlling stake in Rockefeller Center for $1.4 billion in 1989, it sparked outrage in America but celebration in Japan. The symbolism was powerful. Japan was buying pieces of American identity, American cultural landmarks, American pride. The Nikkei stock index, which had been around 10,000 in 1985, soared to an all-time high of 38,915 by the end of 1989. Japanese companies had price-to-earnings ratios that made no economic sense. Some stocks were trading at P/E ratios of 60, 80. Even 100 times earnings, valuations that suggested investors believed these companies would grow exponentially forever. None of it was sustainable. Everyone knew it was a bubble. But the cheap money kept flowing, and the bubble kept inflating. Banks were lending with reckless abandon, often with little regard for the borrower's ability to repay. The collateral for these loans was usually real estate or stocks. Assets whose values were themselves inflated by the very lending that was using them as collateral. It was a circular logic that could only end in disaster if asset prices stopped rising. The collateral would lose value. Borrowers would default, and banks would be left holding worthless paper. But as long as prices kept going up, the system could perpetuate itself indefinitely. That's the seductive nature of bubbles. They work perfectly until they don't. French economist Thomas Piketty would later create a chart that showed the Japanese bubble in stark relief. Between 1985 and 1990, the ratio of private sector capital to national income in Japan shot up from under 500% to about 700%. It was the largest bubble to inflate anywhere in the world between 1970 and 2010. The wealth was intoxicating. Japanese businessmen felt invincible. But underneath the champagne and the skyscrapers and the soaring stock prices, the foundation was rotting. The bubble represented something deeper than just inflated asset prices. It represented a massive failure of investment. In a healthy economy, investment flows toward productive uses: new factories, better technology, improved infrastructure, innovation. But Japan in the late 1980s had lost its vision of the future. For decades, the country had been in an economic marathon, chasing after Europe and America, catching up, getting better. Now they had caught up. They had arrived. But they didn't know what to do next. So instead of investing in the future, they invested in speculation. They bought assets hoping those assets would go up in price so they could sell them to someone else for more money. It was a pyramid scheme disguised as prosperity. There's a telling anecdote from this era that captures the absurdity. A senior executive at one of Japan's largest real estate companies was asked how he justified the astronomical valuations in Tokyo property. His answer: Tokyo is different. Land values here can only go up because they're not making any more land. This is the kind of magical thinking that pervades every bubble. The rules of economics and gravity don't apply this time because this situation is unique. Except it never is. The laws of economics always reassert themselves eventually. Japan was about to learn this lesson in the most painful way possible. All bubbles burst. Eventually, Japan's exploded in 1990. The Bank of Japan, finally recognizing the danger, raised interest rates sharply to deflate the bubble before it got even worse. The Nikkei collapsed. Real estate prices plummeted. Companies and banks that had borrowed heavily against inflated asset values suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. The assets were worthless, but the loans still had to be repaid. Japanese banks had balance sheets full of non-performing loans. They became what economists call zombie banks, technically alive but unable to fulfill their basic function of lending to healthy businesses. The crash didn't happen all at once. It was more like watching a slow-motion car accident unfold over years. Real estate followed a similar trajectory. Property prices in Tokyo's central districts fell by 80 to 90% from their peaks. A piece of land that sold for $100 million in 1990 was worth $10 million by 2003. Homeowners who had taken out mortgages based on inflated property values found themselves underwater, owing more on their homes than the homes were worth. Many walked away from their mortgages, but in Japan's system, that doesn't discharge the debt. People were left paying for houses they no longer owned for decades. The government bailed out the banks with capital infusions and cheap credit from the central bank, but it wasn't enough to restart growth. Those zombie banks kept lending to zombie companies, debt-ridden firms that were too big to fail but too broken to grow. They shambled along, consuming resources and credit that could have gone to innovative new businesses. The economy stagnated. The lost decade had begun. Except it wasn't just one decade. It was two. Then three. Then four. The banking crisis revealed a deeper problem with the entire Japanese economic system: the close relationships between banks, corporations, and government. The same relationships that had powered Japan's post-war growth now became a liability. Banks were reluctant to call in bad loans from companies they had long-standing relationships with. The government was reluctant to force banks to recognize losses because that would trigger bankruptcies and unemployment. Everyone hoped that if they just waited long enough, growth would return and the problem would solve itself. It was a collective delusion that wasted decades. From 1991 to 2003, Japan's GDP grew only 1.14% annually. Between 2000 and 2010, average real growth was about 1%, well below other industrialized nations. But the most devastating numbers are these: from 1995 to 2025. Japan's nominal GDP fell from $5.55 trillion to $4.27 trillion. Real wages fell around 11%. The country experienced deflation, meaning prices actually decreased over time. Japan's share of the world's nominal GDP collapsed from 17.8% to just 3.6%. In 1985, Japan was on track to become the world's largest economy. Today, it's the fourth largest, recently overtaken by Germany and India. And its economy in nominal terms is roughly half the size it was a decade ago. The human cost is harder to quantify but no less real. A generation of Japanese workers saw their salaries stagnate or decline. Young people couldn't find good jobs. The promise that had defined post-war Japan, work hard, and you'll prosper, was broken. University graduates who would have once been guaranteed positions at major corporations found themselves stuck in temporary jobs with no benefits and no security. The term freeter entered the Japanese vocabulary, describing young people who freelanced from one temporary job to another, never building careers or financial stability. Birth rates collapsed as economic anxiety made people delay or forego having children. Why bring a child into a world where prosperity seemed impossible? The cost of raising children in Japan's expensive cities, combined with uncertain economic prospects, made parenthood seem like a luxury rather than a natural life stage. The population started shrinking. Today, 29.3% of Japan's population is over 65, the highest proportion in the world. The median age is 49.8 years. Annual births fell below 700. Zero in 2024, a milestone that wasn't supposed to happen until 2039. The demographic death spiral is accelerating faster than anyone predicted. There's a term that emerged during this period: lost generation. It refers to the young people who graduated from university between the mid-1990s and late 2000s, who entered the job market during the worst of the economic stagnation. Many never found permanent employment. They spent their 20s and 30s in temporary jobs, never accumulating savings, never buying homes, never starting families. Now they're in their 40s and 50s, facing an uncertain retirement with inadequate savings and weak pension prospects. An entire cohort was sacrificed to the economic catastrophe that began with the Plaza Accord. Social problems multiplied. Japan, which had once prided itself on low crime rates and social cohesion, saw increases in depression, social withdrawal, and suicide. The phenomenon of hikikomori, young people who withdraw from society entirely, sometimes not leaving their rooms for years, became widespread. The traditional social contract was broken. The government and corporations had promised security in exchange for loyalty and hard work. That promise was now revealed as hollow. But here's where the story gets truly alarming. Japan never stopped trying to stimulate its way out of stagnation. Decades of deficit spending and ultra-low interest rates have created a debt monster that now threatens not just Japan but the entire global financial system. As of the end of 2024, Japan's government debt stands at 1.32 quadrillion yen, that's $8.67 trillion, representing 263% of GDP. To put that in perspective, Italy, which is considered a debt crisis waiting to happen, has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 137%. Japan's ratio is nearly double that. The sheer magnitude of this debt is difficult to comprehend. If you tried to pay it off at a rate of $1 million per day, it would take you 23,700 years. The interest payments alone, even at near-zero rates, consume massive portions of the government budget. And remember, this debt has been accumulated over decades of trying to stimulate an economy that refused to grow. Every recession, every crisis, every disappointment has been met with more government spending financed by more borrowing. The debt has become a rolling snowball that grows larger with each passing year. Here's the terrifying part: 4 years. This debt was manageable because interest rates were zero or even negative. The Bank of Japan owns nearly half of all Japanese government bonds, and much of the rest is held by domestic banks and insurance companies, as long as rates stayed at zero. Servicing this debt was cheap, but that's changing. In 2024, the Bank of Japan finally started raising interest rates for the first time in 17 years as inflation rose above 2%. Even tiny rate increases have enormous consequences when you're dealing with debt of this magnitude. Each 1% increase in average borrowing costs adds 3.6 trillion yen to annual debt servicing. Equivalent to 0.7% of GDP. Debt servicing costs are now projected to consume 22% of the national budget, and that number is rising. The math is brutal and inescapable. Japan has 180 trillion yen in government bonds that need to be refinanced over the next 5 years. If rates continue to normalize even to 1%, still historically low annual debt service costs could rise by 18 trillion yen, equivalent to 20% of government revenues. Meanwhile, the tax base is shrinking by 300,000 workers annually due to demographics. There are fewer people working and paying taxes, while more people are retired and collecting benefits. The government is caught in a vice. They can't cut spending without triggering a recession. But they can't keep borrowing forever without risking a debt crisis. And here is what keeps economists awake at night. What happens if investors lose confidence in Japan's ability to service this debt? Right now, Japanese government bonds are considered safe because they are denominated in yen and held mostly by domestic investors who are unlikely to dump them, but that calculus could change. If domestic investors start demanding higher yields to compensate for increased risk, or if foreign investors who hold the remaining bonds start selling, interest rates would spike. A spike in interest rates would make the debt unsustainable, forcing default or monetization through inflation. Either option would be catastrophic not just for Japan but for the global economy. The Bank of Japan finds itself in an impossible position. They hold so many government bonds on their balance sheet that rising interest rates create massive unrealized losses. As of September 2024, the BOJ's unrealized losses on its bond holdings stood at 10.5 trillion yen. If rates continue rising, these losses grow. But if the BOJ tries to prevent rates from rising by buying more bonds, they risk stoking inflation and further weakening the yen. It's a damned if you do. Damned if you don't scenario with no good options. Some economists now argue that Japan represents the single biggest threat to global financial stability. The yen carry trade where investors borrow yen at low interest rates and invest in higher yielding assets elsewhere has grown to approximately $20 trillion, equivalent to 505% of Japan's GDP. This isn't some obscure corner of the financial system. Virtually every major financial institution in the world participates in yen carry trades: hedge funds, investment banks, corporate treasuries, insurance companies. They've all borrowed cheap yen to invest elsewhere. In August 2024, just a 7% appreciation of the yen triggered $6.4 trillion in global equity market losses within weeks as carry trades unwound. Investors who had borrowed yen to buy stocks suddenly faced margin calls. They had to sell their stock positions to repay yen loans that had become more expensive due to currency appreciation. The selling pressure cascaded across global markets, and this was just a 7% move. Japan's debt situation forces a true crisis. The resulting yen appreciation and carry trade liquidation could dwarf the 2008 financial crisis. Imagine what happens if Japan's government can't refinance its debt, or if the Bank of Japan loses control of interest rates. The yen would likely spike as investors rush to repay yen-denominated loans. That spike would force immediate liquidation of trillions of dollars worth of assets around the world. Stock markets would crash, bond markets would seize up, banks that had leveraged their balance sheets using yen funding would face instant insolvency. The contagion would spread faster than any policymaker could respond. This is not a hypothetical tail risk. It's a realistic scenario that financial risk managers are actively gaming out. Now here's where this story connects to today's geopolitical landscape. China was watching. When the Plaza Accord happened, China was still a poor, developing country. But Chinese leaders studied what happened to Japan very carefully. They saw how currency appreciation destroyed Japan's export competitiveness and triggered a bubble that led to decades of stagnation. They learned the lesson, and the lesson was simple: never give the Americans the power to dictate your currency policy. Chinese officials in the 1980s and 90s were obsessed with understanding Japan's mistakes. Study groups were formed, detailed analyses were commissioned. The Plaza Accord became a case study in Chinese policy circles about what happens when you trust American promises of mutual benefit. The Chinese Communist Party concluded that the Plaza Accord was economic warfare dressed up as cooperation, and they were determined never to fall into the same trap. Fast forward to the 2000s and 2010s, China's export-driven growth is creating the same tensions with America that Japan faced in the 1980s. The trade surplus is enormous. American manufacturing is hollering about unfair competition. The Chinese currency, the yuan, is arguably undervalued, and the Americans start making noise about a new Plaza Accord for China. The playbook is identical to 1985. Some American officials and economists openly call for coordinated international pressure on China to appreciate the yuan. The rhetoric is the same. China's currency manipulation is harming American workers, creating trade imbalances, and destabilizing the global economy. But this time, China says no. Chinese officials explicitly rejected any Plaza Accord-style agreement. They maintained strict control over their currency and capital flows. They refused to let the yuan appreciate rapidly. They built up massive foreign exchange reserves as a buffer, over $3 trillion at the peak. When pressure mounted, they pushed back hard, willing to accept trade friction rather than repeat Japan's mistake. The Chinese Communist Party had studied Japan's lost decades as a cautionary tale, and they were determined not to become the next victim of American currency manipulation. The difference in responses is striking. Japan, a military ally dependent on American security guarantees, felt it had no choice but to cooperate. Japan's leaders believed that maintaining the US-Japan alliance was worth the economic cost. They were wrong, but by the time they realized it, the damage was done. China, on the other hand, had no such dependence. China had its own military, its own nuclear deterrent, and a political system that didn't answer to American pressure. When America pushed, China pushed back. This is why understanding the Plaza Accord matters today. The tactics that worked against Japan in 1985, forcing currency appreciation through coordinated international pressure, don't work when the target country refuses to cooperate. China learned from Japan's experience that short-term trade friction is preferable to long-term economic devastation. They saw that once you agree to significant currency revaluation, you lose control of your economic destiny. The market takes over. Speculation amplifies the move, and what was supposed to be a modest adjustment becomes a catastrophic revaluation. But China didn't just refuse to cooperate. They built an entire economic strategy around avoiding Japan's fate. They diversified their economy away from pure export dependence. They built domestic consumption capacity. They invested heavily in technology and innovation. They created multiple growth engines so that no single shock could destroy their entire economic model. And perhaps most importantly, they maintained capital controls that prevented the kind of speculative bubbles that destroyed Japan. Hot money couldn't flow into and out of China with the freedom it had in Japan. There's also a deeper lesson here about the limits of American power. The Plaza Accord worked against Japan because Japan was willing to be pressured, but American economic hegemony depends on other countries accepting American leadership. When China refused to play along, the entire strategy fell apart. The Americans couldn't force China to appreciate the yuan without Chinese cooperation. Trade sanctions and tariffs created friction but didn't achieve the fundamental currency realignment that the Plaza Accord had delivered. That said, the similarities are uncanny. Japan's spectacular growth in the 1970s and 80s was characterized by a manufacturing export boom, fed by an artificially competitive exchange rate. Its economy was commonly forecast to surpass the United States. The Americans were greatly upset, especially by Japan's large current account surplus and manufacturing success. Today, China's rise follows a similar pattern, an export-driven growth model, an undervalued currency, providing competitive advantage, American anxiety about being overtaken. The same narrative of unfair competition, the same political pressure in Washington to do something. China, too, needs structural change towards consumption rather than exports. The Chinese economy is still too dependent on exports and investment, and not enough on domestic consumption. This creates vulnerabilities. But unlike Japan, China has managed this transition on its own terms, at its own pace, rather than having it forced upon them by external pressure. Perhaps the main difference is that Japan went into the Plaza Accord voluntarily, eager to ward off the inevitable alternative of draconian export controls which they thought would be still more damaging. China calculated differently. They decided that resisting American pressure, even at the cost of trade tensions, was better than surrendering control of their currency. So, was the Plaza Accord deliberate economic warfare or a policy mistake with unintended consequences? The truth is probably somewhere in between. American policymakers in 1985 genuinely wanted to address trade imbalances and saw currency adjustment as a solution, but they also knew that yen appreciation would damage Japan's competitiveness. And they pushed for far more dramatic changes than Japan anticipated. When the yen appreciation spiraled beyond the original 10 to 12% target, American officials did little to slow it down. The Louvre Accord of 1987 attempted to stabilize currencies, but by then the damage was done. What's undeniable is the result. Japan, which was poised to become the world's largest economy, never recovered. 40 years after the Plaza Accord, Japan is still mired in low growth, deflation, demographic decline, and mounting debt. The lost decades have become the lost half-century. An entire generation has known nothing but economic stagnation. Meanwhile, the United States remains the world's largest economy, with the dollar still serving as the global reserve currency. The irony is that America's trade deficit with Japan never really disappeared. It just shifted to China. The fundamental problem that the Plaza Accord was meant to solve, American deindustrialization and trade imbalances, wasn't actually solved. American factories didn't suddenly become competitive again. American workers didn't get their jobs back. What happened instead is that manufacturing moved from Japan to other low-cost locations, particularly China and Southeast Asia. The trade deficit remained, but the beneficiaries changed. For Japan, though, the consequences were permanent and devastating. In 1985, Japan's GDP was $1.43 trillion compared to America's $4.23 trillion. Japan was catching up fast. Today, the U.S. economy is nearly $30 trillion, about 7.5 times larger than in 1985. Japan's economy is around $4 trillion, barely quadruple its 1985 size. The gap that had been closing rapidly in the 1970s and 80s is now wider than ever. Japan went from rising challenger to cautionary tale. The story of the Plaza Accord is a reminder that in international economics, there are no permanent allies, only permanent interests. It is a reminder that currency values aren't just numbers on a screen, they are weapons that can be wielded to advance national interests. And it's a warning that when you're rising fast enough to challenge the established order has ways of slowing you down. Japan learned that lesson in 1985. China learned it by watching Japan. The question is, who's next, and will they see it coming? There's a broader pattern here that goes beyond just Japan and China. Throughout economic history, rising powers that threaten to overtake the established hegemon face pressure, constraints, and sometimes outright sabotage. Britain did it to emerging industrial powers in the 19th century. America has done it repeatedly in the 20th and 21st centuries. The methods change. Sometimes it's military intervention, sometimes it's financial pressure, sometimes it's currency manipulation, but the goal is always the same: maintain dominance. What makes the Plaza Accord particularly instructive is how it was disguised as cooperation. This wasn't an invasion or a sanctions regime. It was an agreement that Japan voluntarily entered into, believing they were participating in a multilateral effort to promote global stability. Only in hindsight did it become clear that Japan had signed its own economic death warrant. The lesson for rising powers is clear: be very careful about what international agreements you sign, especially when the established hegemon is the one proposing them. Today, as we watch the continued tensions between the United States and China, the ghost of the Plaza Accord looms large. American politicians still talk about currency manipulation. They still complain about trade imbalances. They still want China to appreciate its currency. But China remembers what happened to Japan, and they're playing a very different game. Whether they can maintain this resistance as their economy slows and their own debt problems mount remains to be seen. The next decade will reveal whether China's strategy of controlled currency management and capital controls can withstand American pressure, or whether they too will eventually succumb. And what about Japan? Is there any path forward for an economy that's been stagnant for 40 years? The demographic collapse continues. The debt keeps mounting. The zombie companies and zombie banks persist. Some economists argue that Japan's only hope is radical reform, breaking up corporate conglomerates, allowing failed banks to fail, opening the economy to more immigration, pursuing aggressive structural reforms. But such reforms require political will that seems absent. The Japanese political system, built on consensus and stability, struggles to make the kind of bold decisions that might break the cycle. Others argue that Japan is simply the future of all advanced economies: low growth, low inflation, aging populations, high debt, and central banks with limited tools to respond. If that's true, then Japan isn't an exception to be explained away. Japan is a preview of what's coming for Europe and eventually America. The Plaza Accord didn't just destroy Japan's economy. It may have revealed the terminal stage of advanced capitalism itself. If you found this story revealing, make sure you subscribe, because understanding these patterns of economic power is crucial for navigating the financial future. The same forces that shaped Japan's fate are still at work today. And the next chapter of this story is being written right now. Drop a comment and let me know, do you think the Plaza Accord was economic warfare or a policy mistake? And do you think China can avoid Japan's fate? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives from around the world.